Shalom, holy initiates and holy adepts. This is the third part or third video of an ongoing series on the process of emanation of the Sfaroth. Now, in part one, I taught and discussed the process of emanation, that is the process of the actual 10 emanations being emanated from Ein Sof. And in summary, I gave a rather introductory disquisition from certain verses of the Zohar that speak of this process of emanation. And if you watched one of my earliest or first videos, which is Hasfaroth Part 1, in there I give all of the proofs from the scriptures that refer to the creation and 10 emanations of or from Ein Sof. So that is in that video, which if you haven't seen, I suggest that you go. That's the first video that you should see, which is an introduction into Hasfaroth and all of the scriptural proofs for the full esoteric knowledge and wisdom of the full Godhead, which is unknown to practically all Christians. And in the first part of this series, right, I basically gave an overall general overview of this process of emanation, not just from the ancient Christian Qabbalah, but also from the Jewish Qabbalah vis-a-vis its principal text, Sefer HaZohar. In part two, I went even deeper, where I covered the process before emanation. So I'm still discussing the process of emanation in that video, but I'm actually discussing some of the initial stages of emanation, which aren't explicitly covered in the Zohar. And so from in the second video, we proceeded to the Lurianic Qabbalah, which does an extremely good job of explaining in high detail the initial stages of the process of emanation with great detail. And so now in this third installment, I'm going to go even deeper, right? Again, we are going to begin from the Lurianic Qabbalah. Now, some very essential points need to be first made discussing the Lurianic Qabbalah, because the Lurianic Qabbalah basically teaches some very, very, very profound and esoteric mystical knowledge and wisdom. It contains knowledge and wisdom that is so esoteric that it is not really even found in the Cordoverian system of Qabbalah. And it's not even explicitly stated in some of the principal Kabbalistic treatises. It's only subtly or implicitly alluded to. And so what Lurianic Qabbalah does is that when Yitzhak Luria, who was the Rab or master of this system, first came on the scene, essentially what he did was he propelled very, very esoteric Kabbalistic doctrines. He propelled them forward to make them more prevalent and widespread amongst the Yehudim or the Jews. And this was a really good thing. So when Yitzhak Luria comes on the scene, now for the first time, more esoteric aspects of the Kabbalah are now being revealed, right? So we have to understand that this this wholly preordained revelation of the holy mysteries occurred in stages. And so we have in the 12th century that a good bulk of the holy mysteries was revealed through a few principal texts, right, which include Sefer HaZohar. And I would say maybe a good 70% of the holy mysteries was revealed, but there was still a 30% or so or more that were not revealed through these principal texts. That is, all of the holy mysteries and knowledge and wisdom, which, by the way, is infinite in nature, which cannot even be contained all in books, but a good majority of it was contained in these principal books. And it wasn't until about 300 or so years later during this time that more principal treatises were being released, you know, in a time-step fashion. And so then by the time you get to Yitzhak Luria, you already have some additional very, very esoteric principal treatises that are already circulating amongst the Kabbalists. And then once Yitzhak Luria comes on the scene, he propels some very, very esoteric doctrines into the forefront of the Qabbalah. And then you fast forward, a few hundred years later to our generation, or a few generations before, these esoteric doctrines become much more prevalent and widespread amongst the Yehudim, or the Jews. Now, one of these very, very esoteric mystical doctrines, which was only known amongst the most elite and initiated Kabbalists, which was probably just a handful between the 1300s and 1600s, was this concept in the Lurianic Qabbalah that's known as Tzimtzum, which simply means contraction. And as I said previously in the second video, I gave an overall general overview and explication of this esoteric concept, which refers to the initial stages prior to the emanation of the Sefirot. Now, another point that needs to be made is that there are many scholars, these are secular Kabbalistic scholars, who, and even many uninitiated Kabbalists, and scholars will generally say that, will generally make remarks to the effect that, some of these esoteric concepts that are found in the Lurianic Qabbalah, were not known beforehand, or are new concepts that he introduced. Many are surprised, like, wow, these concepts, are not found in the Zohar or in the principal text. Where did they come from? It's so new. It's so so innovative, in nature. But these are all very erroneous and fallacious remarks by, again, uninitiated scholars and even Kabbalists. Because the truth of the matter is, as I have already stated previously, this concept of Tzimtzum was known way before Yitzhak Luria came on the scene. That is, the most initiated Kabbalists, well before Yitzhak Luria, were already initiated into this very esoteric concept of Tzimtzum. That is, all Yitzhak Luria was doing was, for the first time, openly revealing this and propelling it forward. Now, I should make the remark that it was not Yitzhak Luria that propelled this esoteric doctrine into the forefront, nor was it his chief disciple, Chaim Vital, who did this, because it must be totally understood, and this is, and I state this very emphatically, that Yitzhak Luria and Chaim Vital, being chief Kabbalists, were sworn to secrecy and did not want their holy teachings and the holy mysteries to be released. In fact, it was done contrary to their command. It was their disciples that redacted their teachings and writings and released these holy mysteries out into the open. But it should be emphatically understood that it was not the intention of Yitzhak Luria and his chief disciple Chaim Vital to release these holy mysteries, this holy knowledge, which was esoteric for thousands of years, right? So it was their disciples, and it's a long story. I don't want to get into it in this video, but essentially they were the ones that redacted and their teachings and some of their writings against their will, essentially. So these are very important points to make. So in summary, anyone who states that some of these esoteric doctrines found in the Lurianic Qabbalah are heretical or innovative or new, that's far from the truth. And you have to understand that these people who make these remarks are just simply ignorant and uninitiated. And then the second point is that it was through divine providence that these holy mysteries were released, to the Yehudim, and then finally in our generation to all of the Goyim, for that matter. But again, it was against the will of Yitzhak Luria and some of his chief disciples for these holy mysteries to be released, because again, they were under a strict mandate of divine silence. But everything is preordained from the foundations of the universe, and it was Adonai's intention for it eventually to be released, and so it was. So now we'll proceed to give some proofs that indeed this mystical concept of Tzimtzum far precedes Yitzhak Luria. And so that brings us to a very Kabbalistic secret society that was operating in medieval Spain, known as the Circle of Iyun. And the Hebrew word Iyun signifies contemplation. And this secret society of just a handful of Kabbalists in medieval Spain were the grand masters, so to speak, of Qabbalah, of their generation. And they basically wrote a few principal Kabbalistic treatises that are highly esoteric and mystical, of a very high order. And within these Kabbalistic treatises is where we find the mystical, esoteric concept of Tzimtzum. Now, the first reference that I will give of this is actually found in a very, I guess, rare manuscript that Gershom Scholem apparently had access to. Gershom Scholem was the leading secular scholar on the Kabbalah in the last generation. I say secular, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, he was a very, very elite scholar, secular scholar, if I'm not mistaken, on Kabbalah in the last generation. And in his books, his very scholarly books on Kabbalah, he actually provides a citation to a manuscript of a very esoteric Kabbalistic treatise from this secret society of these Spanish Kabbalistic grandmasters, and a treatise that speaks on the 32 paths of wisdom, which is a manuscript, I guess, that was from Florence. In folio 101a, it reads, "How did he produce and create this world?" In reference to Ein Sof. "Like a man who gathers in and contracts his breath." Now, Rab Shem Tov ben Shem Tov had a different rendition of this citation where it read, "and contracts himself." But nevertheless, the point here is that in this highly esoteric treatise, they are elucidating this very mystical concept in the form of a parable, in this case of a man breathing in his breath, or contracting himself through his breath. Now, we also read in another very esoteric Kabbalistic treatise of this secret society, in one of their principal treatises, which is called Sefer Iyun, or the Book of Contemplation, which has several versions in circulation. And the citation here that I include is from the long version, which and the citation here it would be found in line 36. Now, there are three principal known full Kabbalistic treatises that we have from the secret society, and so this is one of them, Sefer Iyun. And the citation I provide here in this slide is actually my Hebrew translation of the underlying Hebrew. And basically it states, "Wisdom came into being from ayin, which is nothingness, from the contraction or the reduction or the removal, which is the contraction or the omission or the withholding of the highest aspect." Now, here in this very esoteric Kabbalistic treatise, these Kabbalistic grandmasters are revealing this holy mystery, which is that the second emanation, which is Chokhmah or wisdom, proceeded from the first emanation, which is Kether or Ayin, and it was done through contraction or an omission of Ein Sof. So these two emanations, which are the first two emanations, came into being through a divine contraction, right? So here we have is a proof of the first mention of this or revelation of this holy concept in a very esoteric Kabbalistic treatise from the 12th or 13th century, right, which far predates Yitzhak Luria. Now, what is Ein, which is the Hebrew word for nothingness? This is a code word in reference to Kether, which is the first emanation. What is the proof? Well, the proof is found in Sefer Iyov in chapter 28, verse 12, where the literal interpretation is essentially, where is wisdom found? This is the first level of interpretation of this verse. But if you were fluent in ancient Hebrew and were a Kabbalist, you would then understand the Kabbalistic or esoteric rendition of this verse, which would be the sixth or seventh level of interpretation, which is as we Kabbalists read, which is, and Chokhmah, or wisdom, from Ayin, it came into being. And we find this Kabbalistic rendition in Sefer HaZohar Ampasim. That is, there are many folios that give this Kabbalistic esoteric understanding of this verse, which is only known to initiated Kabbalists. So what the verse on a very Kabbalistic level is saying is that Chokhmah, or wisdom, is from Ayin, or from nothingness, which is a code word for the first emanation. Now, we need to ask, why is the first emanation, Kether, known as Ayin, or nothingness, or nothing? The reason is, simply understood, is because the first emanation came into being within this divine void or vacuum that was produced from the contraction of Ein Sof. And so it is the first emanation that is going to be closest to this divine vacuum or void. And so that's why this first emanation, Kether, is known as nothingness, because its root and its source is in the divine nothingness, which is the divine vacuum or void that was formed through the divine contraction of Ein Sof. Now let us proceed to some more proofs from our principal Kabbalistic texts, right? That indeed there was a divine contraction that preceded the initial stages of emanation. We read in Sefer Yetzirah, in chapter 1, verse 5, it states, 10 Sefirot of nothingness, their measure is 10, which have no end, a depth of beginning, a depth of end, and so on. So what this verse goes on is, it goes on to enumerate 10 depths. One depth for each emanation of the 10 Sefirot. So what it's doing is, it is likening or equating every emanation of the 10 Sefirot to a depth. Now, this is important because the Hasfarot are essentially of the essence of nothingness or non-existence, right? The verse says 10 Sefirot of nothingness. What does this mean? Well, they're 10 Sefirot of nothingness because the root and source, right, of these Sefirot is really the first emanation, Kether, because the first emanation, Kether, produced the subsequent 9 emanations. And the first emanation, Kether, which is known as Ein, or nothingness, has its root and source in the divine nothingness or non-existence, right? So they are 10 Sefirot of nothingness because their root and source is the nothingness or the non-existence or the divine void and vacuum as a result of the divine contraction of Ein Sof. And the reason that 10 depths are mentioned is because a depth implies a reduction of matter or substance or a contraction, right? And these 10 Sefirot were produced from a divine contraction, right? When Ein Sof contract himself to form this void or vacuum, we may think of this void or vacuum as a depth that was formed within Ein Sof. And within this depth were hollowed out or engraved 10 depths, which are the 10 Sephiroth. And this is why we read then in chapter 2, verse 6 of Sefer Yetzirah, where it states, he made non-existence into existence, right? As a result of the divine contraction of Ein Sof, which produced a vacuum or void, or we may say non-existence, from this void or vacuum, or this non-existence of nothingness, was produced actual existence, which are the 10 emanations of Ha-Sephiroth. And so now let us proceed to the proofs from Ha-Torah, because what are we to say? Are we to say that, well, it could be argued that these highly mystical points, these holy mysteries that are revealed in these principal Kabbalistic treatises vis-a-vis Sefer HaZohar, Sefer Yetzirah, etc., right? These are not just writings that were pulled out of the butt of some random person. They weren't just pulled out of thin air. These are holy mysteries that were put into writing by highly initiated saints. And before them, gods in the flesh. And these holy mysteries have their root and their basis and foundation in the Holy Word, that is the Torah. And the first Kabbalistic axiom or foundational point of Ha-Qabbalah, understood by all holy adepts and initiates, is that all knowledge and wisdom, and I mean all knowledge and wisdom of the universe, is contained, encoded, encrypted within the Holy Word, that is Ha-Torah. It is one thing to read these Kabbalistic treatises and understand these holy mysteries, but it is a much higher level to understand the divine proofs from the Holy Word and how they were derived from the Holy Word. That, my fellow adepts, is true initiation. And so let us begin with the first divine proof from the Holy Word of this highly esoteric mystical doctrine of Tzimtzum, which is encoded and encrypted within the second verse of Sefer Bereshith, where we read, "And the earth was void and formless, and darkness was upon the faces of the deep." Now, on the most literal level of interpretation, this verse is alluding to the creation of the earth. That is level 1 interpretation. Level 5 or level 6 interpretation of this verse is actually alluding to the formation or creation of the 10th emanation of the Sefirot, which is Shekhinah, our Heavenly Mother, Baruch He, blessed is she. And you will only find the 5th or 6th level of interpretation of this verse in our most esoteric principal treatise, which is Tikkunei HaZohar. The 7th level of interpretation, which is the most esoteric and mystical level of interpretation of this verse, which has been locked and sealed for thousands of years, alludes to Tzimtzum. Now, in order to understand this, one must first understand that the creation of the earth represents the image of the creation of Shekhinah, who is the archetype. And the creation of Shekhinah represents an image of the archetypal creation of the Sefirot, or the archetypal Tzimtzum. So when we understand this, we understand that the points or proofs of this is that the earth is circular in nature, just as the Sefirot are circular in nature. And before Shekhinah, or the 10th emanation, which is circular, was created, there was a void and no formation. And darkness implies non-existence or nothingness. And the deep, or a depth, or the abyss, implies a reduction of matter or substance. So this highly esoteric mystical concept of Tzimtzum is encrypted and encoded through this through this parable, through this parabolic statement in the second verse of Sefer Bereshith. And so when you understand all of these symbols and their meanings, and the relationship between the archetype and the images of this archetype, you can then interconnect everything to begin to understand how this verse implicitly alludes to Tzimtzum. Again, these are the holy mysteries that I have just explained, and they are only meant for the holy adepts and initiates, and truly for those that have eyes to see and ears to hear. Amen.